President Trump is finally signing an executive order that will be banning universal mail-in voting and require voter ID at every ballot cast in America.
No, he won't. Well, that's not fair. He probably will be signing an executive order that says we're going to ban mail-in balloting and we're going to require every voter to show a voter ID before casting a ballot in any election from here on out, henceforth no exceptions. But the executive order is not going to mean anything to anybody. Because, and I understand that you may not know this yet because you probably haven't covered it in your high school government class yet, but the pesky little Constitution says that the president gets absolutely no say whatsoever over the administering of our elections. Article 1, Section 4 of our Constitution says that the times, places, and manner of holding our elections will be left up to the individual states, not the federal government. The states get to decide how they want to hold their elections, and sure, the federal government can alter any of those state regulations or set regulations that the state must operate within, but the only people allowed to do that is Congress, and they have to do it through legislation. In other words, this executive order will mean exactly the same, whether it's written on White House letterhead from behind the Resolute desk, or it's written on a piece of single-ply toilet paper from a Motel 6 bathroom.
And this is huge. Mail-in ballots are one of the biggest problems in our past elections. They would get lost, sent to the wrong house, and they were wide open for fraud.
No, hardly any of that is true. Now, do ballots get lost in the mail? Of course. Very, very, very rarely, just like any other piece of mail. Do mail carriers make mistakes? Do administrators make mistakes? Do people filling out the ballots make a mistake in address or signatures? Of course, that happens all the time. But the percentage of that over the course of all of the mail-in ballots is infinitesimally small. But those are all human errors and just mistakes. That's not fraud. Fraud is a very specific, very high legal threshold that you're accusing mail-in balloting of being susceptible to. And regardless on how you might feel on the subject, mail-in balloting is not a source of election fraud. Election fraud in general hardly ever happens, but it very rarely happens in mail-in ballots. Let me show you. A Washington Post analysis in 2020 of data collected by 3 vote-by-mail states with help from the nonprofit Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, found that officials identified just 372 possible cases of double voting or voting on behalf of deceased people out of about 14.6 million votes cast by mail in the 2016 and 2018 general elections, or 0.0025% of all ballots. And if you don't like the Washington Post or ERIC, how about the Heritage Foundation? Yeah, the Heritage Foundation, the far-right conservative Heritage Foundation, tracks voter fraud. 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, hold elections almost entirely by mail and have reported virtually no fraud, according to a Brookings Institution analysis of the Heritage data. The average American is more likely to be hit by lightning than they are to commit voter fraud. Anywhere.
You'll see some people crying over it and calling it voter suppression, and they'll be calling President Trump a dictator for trying to rig the elections. But give me a break. You need an ID to buy alcohol, to rent a car. This executive order is a huge step towards secure, honest, and fair elections in our country.
Yeah, we already have secure, honest, and fair elections in our country. And unless the executive order specifies that this voter ID, that it will be mandatory for everyone to vote, is going to be free and mailed to the people who are eligible to vote, it is voter suppression. If you charge someone for an ID that is required to vote, that's a poll tax. And that's against the Constitution. So yes, in that just one small example, that would be a form of voter suppression. Now, you go on to mention that you need an ID to buy alcohol or rent a car. I would ask you this: where in the Constitution does it guarantee your right to do either of those things? Now, granted, I will admit that the Constitution does not explicitly guarantee the right to vote to everybody, strange as that may sound. But in 1868, when they amended the Constitution to prohibit denying someone the right to vote based on their race, color, or previous servitude, the wording that they chose to include in that amendment said equal protection under the law, which implies that the newly able voting population will have the same protections that the white people had. So all this is to say, you have no constitutional right to buy alcohol. You have no constitutional right to rent a car, but you do have a constitutional right, either directly or indirectly, to vote. And if you're going to put up barriers, if you're going to make it harder for someone to exercise that constitutional right, those actions can become very close to being unconstitutional.